Hello, this is Lindsay McIntyre's bone video, axial skeleton 1 of the lab practical. Hope you enjoy. So, starting off with our cranial bones, we have our frontal bone, we have our two parietal bones, we have our occipital bone, along with this external occipital protuberance, which is the insertion site for the ligamentum nuchae, and we have our two temporal bones on either side. We also have our temporal mandibular joint, which is right here, and we also have our mastoid process. We have our styloid process, our external acoustic meatus, and the squamous part of the temporal bone. Internally, we're going to check out the temporal bone. So, this is our petrous part of the temporal bone, and this houses, in the petrous part is the middle and the inner ear. We also have our internal acoustic meatus, and in the internal acoustic meatus passes through cranial nerves 7 and 8. So now we're going to look at the sphenoid. And the sphenoid, we have the greater wing of the sphenoid, which is right here. Let's see. Let me turn it this way. The greater wing of the sphenoid, which is right there, the lateral view. Then orbitally, the greater wing of the sphenoid is back there. Also, we have our optic canal, our superior orbital fissure right there, and which passes cranial nerves 3, 4, 5, and 6. Internally, we're going to look at the sphenoid now. We have the lesser wing of the sphenoid, and we also have the greater wing of the sphenoid. We also have our optic canal right here, bam, and there. And our optic canal passes the optic nerve and the ophthalmic artery, there and there. And we also have our sella turcica, in which cradles the pituitary gland. Now we're going to look at the ethmoid. And as you can see, the ethmoid is very interesting. We have right here this little, right there, it's called the crista galli, perpendicular part right there. And on either side we have the cribriform plate. And the crista galli serves as an attachment site for the meninges. And the cribriform plate has these little foramina in which pass the olfactory nerves. Now we're going to look at the sutures of the skull. So, we have our coronal suture right there. And our coronal suture is between our frontal and our two parietal bones. We have our sagittal suture, which is between our two parietal bones. We have our lambdoid suture, which is between our two parietal bones and our occipital bone. And we have our squamous suture, which is kind of cut off here, but it would be right there. And our squamous suture is between our temporal bone and our parietal bone. Now, the facial bones. So, we have our maxilla, we have our alveolar process, which is this insertion site for the sockets of the teeth. We have our zygomatic bone and our zygomatic arch, which is made up of the zygomatic process of the temporal bone and the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. And we have our nasal bone right here. And the two bones that make up the bony nasal septum is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid and the vomer. And we also have our inferior nasal concha, which is inferior to the middle nasal concha. It's its own bone right there and right there. And our inferior nasal concha, when we breathe in air, it causes air turbulence and also warms and cools airs as it enters our lungs. Looking at the mandible, here's our body. We have our mandibular angle right here. We have our ramus, which is right here. We have our mandibular condyle, which is up there. We have our mandibular notch, which is right under there, that little divot right there, mandibular notch, and our coronoid process, which is right there. Or even looking underneath right there, coronoid process. Now we're going to look at the vertebral column. So the vertebral column is made up of 4 curves. We have our we have our cervical vertebrae, we have our thoracic vertebrae, we have our lumbar vertebrae, and we have our sacral vertebrae. So the our cervical vertebrae, we have 7 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And our first C1 is our atlas, and this allows us to do this movement. Our C2 is our axis, which allows us to do this movement. And these 7, this first one, the cervical vertebrae of the atlas of the cervical vertebrae, is attachment site for the occipital condyles of the skull. And what's unique about the cervical vertebrae is that they have transverse foramen. So now the thoracic vertebrae, we have 12. So right from here all the way down to here. And looking at the thoracic vertebrae, we have our transverse process, our spinous process, our 2 transverse process. We have our intervertebral foramen, which passes the spinal nerves and passes through the spinal nerves in the intervertebral foramen. We also have our body, or centrum, and the intervertebral discs are sandwiched in between the body of the vertebrae for cushioning. Looking at the lumbar vertebrae, we have 5 of them. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 right here. And we also have our sacrum, which is made up of 5 sacral vertebrae. And down here we have our coccyx. Our sternum, we have the body, the manubrium, the xiphoid process, and the jugular notch. And last but not least, we have our ribs. So we have our vertebrosternal, or true ribs. Those are ribs 1 through 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And we have our vertebrocondyl, or false ribs, which are these 3, 4, 5. We also have our last 11 and 12 are our floating ribs right here. And that is the axial video, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.